You step into a bookshop exploring the Chinese section, only to find a few textbooks and a Learn Chinese in your car. But in the English section, shelves overflow with resources for Chinese speakers learning English, and you wonder, could I use these books to help me learn Chinese? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to discuss learning materials designed for Chinese people learning English. And we're going to see if it's a good idea to use these materials to learn Chinese instead. Content, or what you study, is one of the three key factors that determine success in learning Chinese, something we discussed in episode 203. So which learning materials you choose does matter. If you like books, you've probably been in a few bookshops and checked out what kind of resources they have available for Chinese learners, and the results are usually very depressing. There might be a few textbooks if you're lucky, maybe a graded reader, maybe one of those Learn Chinese in your car, but unless the bookshop is huge and you're in the right part of the world, there really won't be that much. And even if you are in the right part of the world and the bookshop is huge, there still maybe won't be that many resources for people learning Chinese. But as I said in the intro, if you go over to the section for people learning English, and this is of course especially true in, say, East Asia, you will see that there are thousands and thousands of titles for Chinese people learning English. And then it's only natural to wonder, can I use these resources for learning Chinese instead? And that is of course what this podcast episode is about. If you've been to one of these bookshops in Asia, you might have seen titles like Business English in 1000 Words, or Guide to Writing Emails in English, or maybe Learning to Speak Like an American in 100 Days, or perhaps Mastering English for Job Interviews in Global Companies, or how about Everyday English Idioms? Naturally, the goal here is not to use these books to learn English. I mean, yes, you could, but then you're in the wrong podcast, because here we are hacking Chinese, not English. However, if you actually go to a bookstore and you leaf through these books, you will realize that there is a ton of Chinese in most titles like this. It's actually probably true that it's more Chinese in them than English. And that is because, just like people in the West, Chinese people like to be safe when they're learning a language. They don't like to do everything in the target language. And so you will have many books where they explain a lot. And this is, of course, done in Chinese. There might also be translations or other things written in Chinese, and you might think, how about using this Chinese to learn about, say, business Chinese, even though, of course, the book is about business English. So can these books be used to learn Chinese? Well, yes, but. And in the rest of this episode, I will talk about this, first the but and then the yes. Before we do that though, let me clarify that we're talking about ESL here, English as a second language, and then for a Chinese audience. And I will not say that all the way through this discussion, because it gets very tedious. The question then is, can we use ESL resources to learn Chinese, given that we are also speakers of English in some capacity? The answer, like I said, is yes, but. So there are things you can learn, but they come at a certain cost. So let's look at the problems here first. To begin with, the level is usually off. So if you buy a book about business English for beginners, for example, well, the English will be at a beginner level, but the Chinese used to describe or talk about this English is certainly not at a beginner level. It will be aimed probably at, say, high school or college students, or maybe adults in the workplace, and their Chinese is much better than yours, probably. And so that means that the Chinese will be much more advanced than the English in the same book. And this shouldn't come as a surprise, but if you then buy a book, say Intermediate Business English, don't expect the Chinese to be intermediate. It's probably going to be full-on advanced immediately. And this is because the English is included for a completely different purpose compared to the Chinese. Well, the English is there because that's what people are studying, but the Chinese is only there to help the reader make sense of the English, and that means there are no restrictions on how hard it can be. As long as the author can communicate with the reader, it's fine. And the typical reader is a native speaker of Chinese, and hence they don't need to care about you, a second language learner who might find this Chinese rather daunting. This is related to the second drawback, that the most common words and phrases aren't the same in both languages. So, for example, if you grab a book with 1000 useful business terms in English, you will find that there is a lot of Chinese in this that explains these words and so on, but you can't then just count on these translations or explanations also being the 1000 most useful business terms in Chinese, just because the English counterparts were deemed to be so. This is because books like this rely on some kind of statistical analysis of frequencies in the language, and naturally these are different in different languages. If you want the most common Chinese words, characters, and components, you can check out episode 100, where we talked about resources for figuring this out. The third problem with using ESL resources for learning Chinese is that the pedagogical thought that went into designing a book was meant for people learning English, not Chinese. And that means, for example, that they might have spent a lot of time making sure that the English is good, that it is appropriate, that it matches their requirements, and so on. But the Chinese is, like I said earlier, only there to explain. For example, if there are sentences with translations, it could be that the Chinese versions of these sentences are not actually very good translations. They're there to show what the English means, as I've said several times now. So, just to give an example, when I designed the sentence pack that comes with my beginner course, Unlocking Chinese, I include word-for-word translations for all the sentences, and this is to show you the logic behind the Chinese sentences. And if you were to study these sentences then, in a vain attempt to learn English, this wouldn't really be a good idea because, of course, nobody speaks like that. And it needn't be this extreme. It could simply be that the person doing the translation chose to stick to a version of Chinese that is a little bit awkward in Chinese, but still stays pretty closely to the original English, thereby being a better explanation. So these then were some reasons why it's not such a good idea to just uncritically use ESL materials to learn Chinese, but as I promised, there are also reasons you might want to do this. There are some benefits too, so let's have a look at those. First and foremost, not all of the drawbacks that I just mentioned apply to all types of content. So there might be very high quality learning materials that do contain very well written Chinese, and then studying the translations might be less of an issue. Well, there could still be an issue with translated sentences not sounding like authentic Chinese, but that's something we've covered elsewhere in episode 90, so do check that out if you're interested. A good example of this might be parallel texts, so you have English on one side and Chinese on the other. So if it's a famous novel in English, you might have the original English on the left side, and then somebody has done a Chinese translation on the right side. And this might be the official Chinese translation, which could be very good. That, though, is pretty hard to say for you if you're an intermediate student, so what I suggest in these cases is that you check these texts with a native speaker, and you just need to ask them to read a few paragraphs maybe, and ask them, is the Chinese here natural? If I wrote like this or spoke like this, would that be okay, or does it sound awkward? And if they say it sounds a bit awkward or maybe not very natural, then you know that this is not a very good translation. But like I said, this is not something you as a learner can typically figure out yourself, so you need help here, and you cannot count on these translations being good either. Moving on, you can use ESL resources for exploring the Chinese language. We talked about, say, 1000 commonly used business terms before, and while the Chinese version of that book will not contain exactly the 1000 most common terms in Chinese business, it will still discuss the topic that you're after here, and many of the words will in fact overlap. And when they discuss these words, there might also be other words that are related that you might also want to learn or find interesting reading about. Naturally, and maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, but studying words from a list is not a good idea. I'm talking about reading about explanations and discussions about business English in order to pick up some words for learning Chinese. I'm not talking about plugging hundreds of words from a book like this into a flashcard app or something like that. If you want to hear more about using or not using lists for learning Chinese vocabulary, you can check out episode 140. The next benefit is related, but instead of exploring the language, you can also explore the culture, so you can make the differences between English and Chinese the point of study. If we keep going with the business example here, but this would work for anything else as well, there could be significant differences in how things are done in Chinese and in English. And I'm not talking about the words, I'm talking about the underlying culture here. How do you express certain things? How do you convey certain information? Maybe Chinese people are more indirect in this situation, and Westerners tend to be more direct, and so on. The point is that if you're reading a book about business English and say interviews or email exchanges and so on, these things will be discussed, and you can also pick up on these differences. Naturally, the book will not explain to the reader how it works in Chinese culture, but it will point out that something is different, and that can be a clue that there might be more things to learn here in Chinese. Naturally, it would then be much better to just find a learning material that does this, that has you as the target audience, but the whole reason for this episode is that there tends to be not many books like that, and the resources aren't that easy to find, and that's why we might consider resorting to using ESL resources instead. Anyway, I think that this is maybe the most interesting use of ESL materials because it tends to highlight these differences, and reading about them can be quite interesting. This brings us to the last benefit, which is reading about familiar topics in Chinese. And since you're listening to this, you are a speaker of English, you know a lot about English, and maybe it's your native language. And then reading about this in Chinese can be both interesting and also a bit easier than reading about, say, Chinese in Chinese, because that's reading about something unfamiliar in an unfamiliar language, and then reading about something familiar in an unfamiliar language is much easier. This is a little bit like looking up your hometown in a Chinese encyclopedia. You know what it says, but you just need to figure out how it's said in Chinese. This means that we are ready to draw a conclusion. Don't use ESL learning materials uncritically, but if you're willing to analyze them a little bit and think about why you want to use them, there also are some genuine benefits. There are some fairly interesting things in these books that you can learn a lot from. Before we wrap up this episode, I'd like to point out the obvious. We are not limited to bookshops when learning Chinese, and there are, of course, many good reading and listening materials online. If you want recommendations, I've put a link to a few articles where I've collected the best resources, and I've put them in the show notes and in the written article on Hacking Chinese. This is not a discussion about online and offline. I mean, there are many resources for learning English online as well, and what I've discussed here applies regardless if you find them in a bookshop or on a website. Do use them, but if they are designed for someone who isn't you, be aware of the effects that this might have and adjust your approach accordingly. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.